It's really great to have Professor Robin Wooffitt here from the Department of Sociology at the University of York. Robin, thank you very much for accepting to do an interview for the DARGchive, and I'm going to start off with a question about how you got interested in conversational analysis and discursive psychology.
By accident.
All right.
I'd always been interested in paranormal experiences, paranormal phenomena, the occult, things like that from when I was a kid. And I knew from an early age that I wanted to do research in that. But I was not clever enough to know what. I had a vague idea that I wanted to look at changing patterns in human, non-human encounters. A kind of quasi-historical piece. And there weren't that many places in the UK at the time, as you can imagine, where there were academics who could supervise that, but York was one of those places. A guy called Dr. Colin Campbell, who is now an emeritus professor at York. He had been interested in sociology, religion and cults, and had supervised a PhD student who had done work on UFO cults. So I contacted him, came up for an interview, and he accepted me, although my ideas were really nebulous. So I arrived up here, and I had a very traditional sociology background at Bristol, and I don't think we knew about ethnomethodology, but things like CA, I think, was mentioned once in a module that might have been called new things you don't really need to worry about. So it really wasn't on my radar when I came to York. And of course, what happens if you go and do a degree in one place, you kind of assume that that's what the discipline is. So when I came to York, it was an eye-opener because there were people doing much more interesting things. So for example, Michael Kay was developing discourse analysis, just finished supervising Jonathan's PhD a few years before. Malcolm Ashmore was there on an endless reflexive loop. Trevor Pinch was there, who had done work with Harry Collins at Bath on parapsychology as an institutional discipline. So it was really exciting. And of course there was CA, which I'd never really encountered before. And I remember being very frustrated because I couldn't really make sense of what I was meant to be doing as a PhD student. I was interested in these experiences. Of course, I didn't have access to the experiences. I just had these accounts that seemed to have been circulated through books and narratives and legends and so on. And I was getting very frustrated. So I thought, well, if I can't get to the experiences, I'll just look at the accounts. And I began to be influenced by ethnomethodology, the constitutive and constructive nature of language, which I was picking up from discourse analysis. So I did a very brief study of, let's see, it was a few reports of UFO encounters from something called Flying Saucer Review. And I was interested in the structure of these narratives, and I handed it to Colin, who was not an empirical sociologist at all. He was very traditionally scholarly. And he took one look at it and said, I think you need to talk to Paul Drew. And so I literally went out of Colin's office, walked across the corridor, knocked on Paul's office and said, apparently I should talk to you. And that's how I ended up doing CA. I became interested in. The shift was from what are people saying to how are people saying it. And that kind of formulated a project which I felt was doable, but also, and this was more important for me, I think, kind of crystallized a set of unformulated anxieties about sociology as a discipline in terms of its methodological rigor and kind of empirical base as well. So yeah, that's it by accident.
Wow.
Had I gone to Norwich, which was the other university I was thinking of, we will be having this conversation.
That's very interesting. So now about your PhD at the University of York, can you talk a little bit about your project and
Yep, it was a study of how people describe personal experiences of a range of paranormal phenomena, ranging from UFO sightings to visions to things that fall outside contemporary classifications and so on. And I just put an advert in the local newspaper here and in Bristol, which said something like, university researcher interested in paranormal experiences, if you care to talk, please contact PO Box, blah, blah, blah. And I went to these people's homes, and they sometimes came to the department, and I just put a tape recorder in front of them, much like you put a camera there. And I said, please tell me what happened. And they did. And it was interesting because I thought I'd get lots and lots of experiences of the kind. Oh, I always know when my mum's going to ring, and you think, okay, mum rings at 4 o'clock every Friday anyway, so that's not particularly interesting. But no, I got some really interesting accounts of experiences of an intensity I had not anticipated. And often these accounts were prefaced with, I haven't told anyone about this. And it sometimes had life-changing consequences. I remember talking to one couple who had essentially moved out of their home because of a series of increasingly violent poltergeist attacks.
Wow.
And they hadn't told anyone until they saw that advert in the paper. So these were really interesting and personal experiences. So I was very grateful for the people who told me these things. And then I just looked at how these were produced. What kinds of structures were operating that shaped these accounts. Now, it wasn't really interactional in the sense that as an interviewer, I was trying not to participate. It's very hard not to, there are always mms and whatnots. But for the basic story, I was pretty much just a passive recipient. So it was mainly about the structure of these narratives, and I wanted to use a CA mentality to get a sense of how these things were built, what devices and practices were being used at the time, and that's what the PhD was, and that came out in Telling Tales.
All right, and what did you find?
I always find it hard to respond to what are your findings. I guess a sense of the delicate moment-by-moment production of an account, even one that may have been reformulated and rehearsed many, many times. The work that people did to normalise others' potential inferences about them as reporters of events which might be taken as evidence for mental instability, or just self-delusion, or wish fulfillment, or just hoax. So there was a delicate management of self and inferences about self from that, which is, I think, one of the reasons I got interested in identity and identity production, because that seemed to be clearly implicated in the ways in which these accounts were being formulated as trustworthy accounts of an objective event, rather than something that was merely subjective and so on.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And can you talk a little bit about what it was like to be a PhD student at the University of York back then?
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, there weren't that many of us, to be honest. I think there were about 2 or 3 others who were doing full-time work that I saw on a regular basis. I know this whole started, I think, towards the end of my PhD. But it was just fantastic. I would come in 9:30, have a cup of tea and a scone, get to work at 10 and leave at 12 hours later.
Wow.
It was just brilliant. Yeah, it was just lovely. It was an interesting place to be because of what Tony, Wootton and Paul were doing in terms of CA and the SSK stroke discourse analyst people. Yeah, it was great.
Sounds really lovely. So besides paranormal experiences, you also worked on other kind of esoteric topics like parapsychology.
Well, parapsychology is it's all the same kind of thing for me, because of course paranormal experiences led to psychical research, led to parapsychology. And parapsychology as a discipline was something I was interested in as an undergraduate. My undergraduate dissertation was a really kind of ill-formulated and pretentious attempt to try to look at how parapsychology had co-opted the language of quantum physics as a way of justifying its status as a proper science, but which didn't have an objective set of phenomena it could point to on a regular basis and say, here they are. So that was always something that was in my mind. The interest in parapsychology came about later on in my career as I got some money from a Cambridge fund called the Paranormal Fund, which is set up to kind of support research in parapsychology. And that brought me out for a year. And I contacted the parapsychology unit at Edinburgh and said, is there any way we could do some work? And I got to know Professor Bob Morris, who was the chair up there at the time. And they had an interesting issue. there was an experimental paradigm called the Ganzfeld, which was a really big thing in parapsychology because it seemed to be close to an experimental procedure that delivered consistent, statistically significant results of ESP. Not always. Big controversy, as always in these things. But one of the things they noticed was that when they were running the experiments, there seemed to be a difference in the success rates depending on the experimenter. Now, this was nothing to do with any chance of fraud or anything like that, because it was kind of fraud-proof. And they thought, is it to do with personality? And of course, that was a psychological. Yeah. And I thought, well, it might be something to do with intellectual practices. So they just gave me a whole bunch of these tapes, and I did an analysis of different kinds of interactional practices across the three experimenters. And that was the stuff that I was doing then. And it's a pity because we could have gone on and done more, but we would have needed much more time to really explore that. But there were certainly differences in the ways in which these folk were conducting the experiments interactionally. Mm-hmm. And I published a couple of papers on that.
Yeah. Would you say you're still interested in that sort of topic now?
Only pedagogically. I'm still interested in teaching about the social psychology laboratory as a social space, right, which is fundamentally ignored in all psychology textbooks. And as soon as you begin to unpick this, lots of things unravel, which I think is interesting from a critical perspective on psychology. But that feeds into teaching in the second and third year, but I'm not actually doing research on that at the moment.
And sort of related to this, you are the director of the Anomalous Experiences Research Unit. Would that sort of keep the interest in this area going, or
well, yeah.
How does that relate to
my current research? Actually, I'm still doing work on that, but in a different sort of way. We might talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
AERU was set up after Bob Morris, who was, as I mentioned, the first professor at Edinburgh. He had died very early on in 2004. So there was a position, Cursor Chair, was open, and I applied for this and got to an interview, which was, very surprising given that I'm not a psychologist or a parapsychologist. So I thought, well, this is good. And the three other people who were interviewed were very well-known skeptics. So, for the most prestigious parapsychology job in the world was an unknown sociologist and three skeptics. And the parapsychological community were really unhappy about this. And there were threats of legal interventions, all sorts of stuff. And I think Edinburgh got cold feet, and in the end they didn't appoint anyone. And I thought, well, to hell with them, I'll have my own unit. So that's when AERU got set up. And it was basically PhDs, some research fellows and other colleagues in the department who were interested. And it has always been a very low, it's a very small unit. It has from time to time been just me. There's another research fellow working with me now. And in fact, I think it's going to be allowed to wither because of university policy. The university has recently realised that it's got units and centres and departments, and it wanted to harmonise these. And it came up with a set of criteria about, if you want to be a unit, you have to be this. If you want to be a centre, you have to be this. And AERU fell foul of all of these criteria because it was essentially just me. So I think it is going to be removed as a web presence. But it has functioned primarily as a beacon for social scientists, people who want to do research, mainly at PhD level, into aspects of the paranormal, but don't want to do it in the parapsychology department, which will lead them directly into experimental work. And it has worked. Every now and then people just find me on the web and say, can I come and work with you?
Wow.
I go, okay, if you find the funding, you can, yes.
That's great. It's really, really cool.
Yeah.
So when you were talking about your PhD, you mentioned that you got interested in sort of the interactional aspects of identity and how those aspects sort of come out in interviews. And that leads me to my next question about your work with Sue Widdicombe. That led to one of the probably most influential works in the discursive psychological approach to identity, the language of human cultures. I was wondering if you could talk about the project, your findings.
Well, with Sue's project, Sue and I met at Bristol as undergraduates, and she was always interested in social identity and new subcultures, and was very taken by social identity theory and then the self-categorization, social categorization, the John Turner development. And when she finished, she went off to Oxford to do a PhD on that. And I think the first part of her PhD was very much traditional sort of methodology, and she was very frustrated. She was handing out questionnaires to kids in local sixth form colleges, and she thought, well, this is not, she was interested in punks and skinheads and goths, and this didn't seem to be connecting. So she was growing critical of that set of approaches. Of course, in the mid-80s, there were new literatures emerging, and so on. And at the same time, I just discovered CA, so I was talking about, well, this is what CA does, and this is how identity could be thought of in these sorts of ways. So we were talking on the same level. And then towards the end of her PhD, she did a sort of discourse analysis chapter. I think she was allowed to do one thing like that, but she knew then, I think that's what she wanted to do. So when she got her first position at Edinburgh, where she still is now, in 1988, she wanted to develop that kind of work. And I was just kind of there in the background going, yeah, okay, we'll do this. So it's her project, but it allowed us to kind of come together with a common set of interests. And it was great fun because collecting the data was, it was just brilliant. We knew that there were certain places in London where particularly subculture members would gather, and we just went there, rocked up. My job was to carry large bags full of lager, because at the time, I'm not sure we could get away with it now, she persuaded Oxford. Of course, she had to offer an incentive to people, and they didn't question how we spent the money, and it was just, well, lager's the best way. So that's how it worked. So I would carry those, and we'd go up to a group of people, and they would say, yeah, we'll be interviewed. So she would take them off one at a time. I would chat with the others, handing out the lager until it was their turn to go and be interviewed. We did interviews in Camden Market, side streets there, Kensington High Street. Skinheads gathered at EROS in Piccadilly in London. I don't know why. So we used to go there, and of course we used to go to festivals. Just rock up at the Reading Festival. And go in and just wander through the tented fields. So
why do you think your study was just so important, and just so it had such a huge effect on...
Right place, right time. It's as simple as that. It's interesting when you sent me the list of questions, said, well, how did you get interested in discursive psychology? Well, there wasn't a thing like discursive psychology. It's just that what I did and what Sue was doing, and then what we were doing together, kind of became part of that as it developed, and it was appropriated, and very happy that it was appropriated by folk in social psychology who are interested in these sorts of issues. So I think it was simply the right place at the right time, and it was. I think it was an intuitively graspable book, in the sense that you could read it and think, oh yeah, okay, I see what these folk are saying, with respect to the way that there are these subtle modulations of identity work, depending on the kind of inferences and upshots that follow from the sort of terms that they would produce at that moment in the interview. So I think it was something that people could point to as a way of saying, okay, this is what this sort of qualitative approach can do. Yeah. I think that's why, but it really was right place, right time.
I see.
That's basically the story of my career.
I'm sure it's more than that. Would you describe yourself more as a conversation analyst, a discourse analyst?
Definitely for me, CA, yeah. And in fact, in the PhD, I wrote my methodology chapter was a sort of engagement with Potter and Weatherall's discourse in social psychology. A sympathetic one, because I could see that, of course, what they were doing was moving in exactly the sort of direction I think I wanted to go, but it felt to me that CA had a bit more empirical grounding to it, and a bit more created more of an exploration, intensive exploration of particular kinds of phenomena. So I've always recognised the strong affinity between discourse analysis and especially discursive psychology. But for me, yeah, I feel that I'm a conversation analyst, although, you know, I haven't ever looked at purely interactional data, just ordinary conversation. So I suspect for a few people that would mean that I'm not a proper conversation analyst.
So given that you've used TA extensively and you've also written about conversation analysis and discourse analysis, what would you say would be, from your position, CA and NDA's contribution to sociology?
Oh, none.
Really?
Well, look at the vast majority of what sociologists do, and it ain't CA.
So then what would be BCA's contribution to knowledge then, and to
I think it's one of the few social scientific methodologies that produces enduring empirical results. And I think that's an extraordinary achievement. So turn-taking is the same now, and our understanding of it came from that 74 paper. Repair practices have not changed since the 70s. Those early discoveries were discoveries, and it's actually very rare to find something in the social sciences you can say is a discovery as opposed to a trend or an argument or a claim or a theme. This had a solidity and objectivity about it, and it, you know, brought out my inner naive physicist. I do think we should have social science as opposed to social commentary. I think there is a place for a traditional social sciences where it is a set of kind of characterizations of the world, but I also want to investigate the world and have something that is there and is identified and is independent of me saying it's there. And I think that's why I have problems with kind of work, kind of some critical discourse analysis, where what they tend to do is look at usually interview data, and I have to say, well, here are 2 or 3 discourses. And you think, you haven't even defined what discourse is. You think, yeah, is that it? Really?
People get away with a lot sometimes.
They get away with a lot, yeah.
So you've talked about some of the...
Can I just come back?
Of course.
Although I think CA has not made any real impact on sociology, I think it has an unrealised transformative potential, in the sense that an awful lot of qualitative sociology is interview data.
Yeah.
Never, ever, ever do you see any consideration in these sorts of studies of the context of the production of those accounts. Time and time again, you read papers or go to presentations where people will just cut out from the interview context a juicy quote, and the juicy quote is presented. And it's so frustrating to me, and I know it's frustrating to other CA colleagues in the department here at York, because you can see how these terms are being built to fit. And you want to say, but this is generated out of that, but that is never shown. And it's really worrying, because I think essentially sociology, qualitative sociology, has used interviews in a really haphazard way. It's as though they haven't calibrated a microscope. And you think, if you did calibrate this, then many of the sorts of empirical claims that are being made would have to be either jettisoned or refined. It doesn't mean you can't use interviews, but it does mean that you have to be entirely sensitive to the ways in which what counts as data is generated out of those interview moments.
So now if we look at psychology, because you have been studying psychology and studying psychological experiments, would you say CA has a contribution to psychology as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would like to see more of that kind of work. Yeah, it's the sort of work that I think some people are doing this now. I know Steve Gibson was looking at those sorts of lines, you know, how these experiments were brought out of a framework of interactional practices. And I would like to see much more of that. Again, I think it would threaten a sort of institutional identity. But then again, yes, I think psychology is better equipped at dealing with this because they've had the concept of demand characteristics for years, and that's just kindly ignored. Just forget about that. It throws a spanner in the works of every experimental thing where people are awake. If they can ignore that, I'm sure they can ignore the rest of it. But it does have those, I think, quite significant but yet unrealised implications for a raft of social sciences, in which I would count psychology.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you've talked about several of the projects that you've done and some of your current research interests. Are there any other projects that you'd like to mention that you're particularly excited about?
Have you read Shegloff's paper, ESP Punter?
No, I haven't. I have to admit, shamefully.
Well, it came out in a Feshrift for Robert Hopper.
Right.
And it's not a CA paper. It's a collection of moments that Shegloff has noticed in which there seems to be a speech error, but which seems to chime or allude to an unstated thought or image in another person's head. And given my interest in the paranormal, when I read this, I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And then a few years later, I started having them and built up a collection. Of course, like Shegloff did, he told colleagues and they had them. So he had his collection and my collection has developed. So I was interested in these and I was wondering how to get a handle on them. And I knew that there had been, in the psychoanalytic literature, a much more openness to unusual or ESP type experiences. So I started delving into that, some historical stuff. And from a 1954 collection of pieces by psychoanalysts on telepathy.
Wow.
There was reference to a paper published in German but not translated into English by an Hungarian psychoanalyst called István Holos. So yes, he'd basically been practicing psychoanalyst for 20 years and he'd noticed what he called telepathic experiences. And he'd written this paper about them after he'd retired. So I got hold of this paper, tracked it down through interlibrary loans, and of course it was in German. But I had a German PhD student at the time.
Right.
Yeah, Jermaine Stockbridge, this she is now. So she translated this, and all the illustrations of the experiences he had had followed exactly the same pattern that Shegloff had identified, and that I was experiencing, and were there in the other accounts other people had presented to me. So I thought, well, this is really interesting because now I can look at an ostensibly parapsychological phenomenon as a thing that has implications for social practices. So it's not just people's accounts of, about which one is agnostic of the of bit. This was, if you like, telepathy and social action. So it allowed me to sort of combine my interests. Of course, you can't do CA on this because these are always going to be anecdotal because there's an unavoidable introspective component. Someone has to say, I was just thinking this at that time. And of course, no one will ever be recording interaction when these things happen. So it's just people sending me anecdotes. But I've been working on those and trying to develop a form of sociological analysis which draws from what we know about interaction that CA has produced, and also kind of Goffman-esque work on interpersonal face management and so on, to see if we can understand these as a form of social action in which work is done on behalf of the other by that punning term.
I look forward to reading about this.
Well, it's out.
All right.
But it's not in places where you would normally expect it.
Okay.
So something like Rolsey, quite understandably, they want empirical data. So I wouldn't go to Rolsey with this because it isn't empirical data in that sense.
All right.
So I've got a paper out in a psychoanalytic journal.
Okay.
The psychoanalysts are so much more open to this, especially in relational and intersubjective psychoanalysis. They publish papers that use parapsychological terms unashamedly. So I offered a sociological version of a phenomenon that someone had noticed, but not noticed in a sociological way. And I've also published in a journal called Subjectivity, which looks at kind of interpersonal relationships and effect, and obviously intersubjectivity, because I think this is a really interesting form of intersubjectivity, potentially, if it is indeed real and not just a bunch of coincidences.
That's really great, and probably it will attract audiences from these places otherwise wouldn't have engaged with maybe this way of doing the work, or
well, we'll see. We'll see.
Sounds really cool. So one of the questions we usually ask our interviews has to do with the fact that many conversation analysts they have some sort of moments in their personal history that they look back to and they say, yeah, this was a defining moment when I understood this really cool thing about CA, or I was inspired by reading a particular paper or by seeing a person do a presentation that kind of opened my eyes to this phenomenon or this way of understanding interaction that I didn't have before.
Yeah.
Do you have such moments in your...
Doing being ordinary by sex.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's one of the papers in the Atkinson and Heritage collection.
Oh, okay.
Where he says, you know, even the mundane has to be brought off.
Yeah.
And that was important because it led to Jefferson's paper on at first I thought, but then I realised.
Right.
And that directly informed, I was just doing X when Y, which was one of the key chapters in Telling Tales. So that was a really important paper. Oh, anything by Sachs was transformative. I was struck by Dorothy Smith's paper, Kay is Mentally Ill, which wasn't CA, but it showed how people's accounts of a phenomenon constituted that phenomenon in a very real sense for people, and with potentially life-changing consequences with respect that someone might be deemed to be worthy of medical intervention. So that was a significant piece, not in terms of its method, but in terms of its orientation to how language is used. I think Paul Drew's paper, Po-Faced Receipt of Teases, is an example of CA at its best, because it has that detailed technical analysis of term production, a focus on tracking a phenomenon relentlessly so that we know all its features, but at the same time acknowledging that this phenomenon is not just a technical phenomenon. These are moments in people's lives. You can feel a beating heart of human beings in that work. And that's not always the case with CA. There are some brilliant technical analyses, but you think, well, I want to know the human story that is inevitably underpinning these term designs. And I think Paul's work has always exemplified precisely that focus on that bringing together the technical and the understanding of the interpersonal concerns that matter. And I think Po-Faced Receipt of Teases was a perfect example of that.
And then my very final question has to do with life outside academia.
Do we have one?
Sometimes, yeah.
I have too many guitars, and I'll leave it at that.
Oh, that sounds lovely. Thank you very much for a fascinating interview.
Thank you.